Hello, long time no see, Kid Kujirai.
Hello, do you want to play with my ball?
No, I do not. By the way, I noticed, why do you sound slightly different every time we meet?
Well, that's because I'm not the same as my brothers.
Wait, so you have like 5 identical brothers or something like that?
Yes.
Like in those home renovation videos where Little John worked
tirelessly for 10 years to afford a 10-square-meter apartment, but suddenly his girlfriend had 6 boys. Tired of the cramped space, leaving Little John no option but to sleep on the floor, he decided to renovate. He inserted galvanized square-shaped bars with expansion screws borrowed from his...
If you're wondering how this connects to the rest of the video, it doesn't. Inazuma's Lore is in many ways more straightforward compared to the other regions, and to immediately falsify that statement, we should start with examining the oldest traces of civilization to be found on Inazuma, for example on Enkanomiya Island. Now, when looking at these ruins, they do bear a striking resemblance to many structures found all across Mondstadt, especially evident when looking at the pillars and ornaments. But considering there's, to my knowledge, very little information on the civilization as of yet, I'm not entirely sure whether this should be taken as a hint towards another Tibet-spanning civilization not dissimilar to the one present in the chasm, and even parts of the world one might consider to belong to Inazuma, I'll get to that later, or if it's just an asset flip. Regardless, as you might have guessed when looking at the total lack of records on the civilization, it ended in a rather unpleasant way, and while again there's no info on exactly how, it stands to reason that either a divine nail or the flood wiped it out. If you don't know what these terms refer to, you might want to consider watching my Lore video, which, contrary to my expectations, has done quite well. Oh, 900 views! Ooh. Wherein I explain both of these events and their respective causes. But to recap, the flood was the first of these events taking place after the primordial one, or hefty principles, however the fuck you want to call them, had enough of their subjects having free will and annihilated them. This flood, by the way, is also almost entirely responsible for the geography of Inazuma, as before it used to be a mostly contiguous landmass until the waves broke it apart. Sometime later, the second descender challenged the primordial one and was subsequently defeated, but due to other parties involved in the war, the primordial one dropped the divine nails all across Teyvat, cleansing the continent of forbidden knowledge, but also causing the death of approximately 100% of all life. I used that line in the last video and I'll do it again. No matter which of these mass extinction events extincted the extinct people here, it seems their lack of existence was severe to a point where humans had ceased to be a thing entirely, at least in Inazuma. It was then around 5,300 years ago that the Tanuki, thanks to the fact their natural predator, Homo erectus, had gone extinct, gained sentience and began ruling the archipelago. Subsequently, the Kitsune arrived from continental Teyvat, presumably Leia, in which case they might have descended from the Adepti, but what matters is that an island of furries is no island of peace and prosperity, and so they fought a war which saw the Kitsune removed as victors, claiming Mount Yogo and the Grand Narukami Shrine for themselves. Now, while their armaments of choice are lost from history, one of either party's tactics has been kept record of. Shapeshifting to look like the enemy, deceiving them to the point of confusion not only on the side of the opposing race but also one's own. This for some reason kept happening throughout the entire conflict, and with each interbred child being born, one chromosome mysteriously disappeared, eventually leading to a child being born so autistic it was considered a human. As such, all modern humans on Inazuma, I don't fucking know, with the exception of the Watatsumi people, are directly descended from fucking furries. I will ignore this fact going forward. More importantly, during the war between the Tanuki and Kitsune, Makoto and Ei were born. They would millennia later go on to triumph over all other gods in the region, with Makoto initially claiming the title of the Electro Archon. Now, of course, I said initially, as during the Cataclysm, Makoto went to Kannazuka alone, despite Ei being the one with vastly superior combat strength, and due to this discrepancy in their fighting prowess, Makoto naturally fucking died, leaving Ei as the Electro Archon. As a result of having lost her sister, Ei then went fucking apeshit and started creating puppets to take her place as representatives, but she planned to bring about eternity in the plane of euthymia or something. I don't know. Point is, these puppets for a long time were pathetic fucking failures, including this dickhead. I honestly do not care whatsoever to tell his story, but he did work as an apprentice to a swordsmith in Tatarasuna, the formerly largest settlement of Kannazuka. Now, as mentioned, Tatarasuna used to be a village centered around mining and forging, when at some point the French came and ruined it for everyone, unleashing a curse upon the region, making it uninhabitable. Okay, now, while it is fun and morally correct to blame the French, that curse had already been present on both Kannazuka and Yasuyori Island. It was just suppressed in Tatarasuna in particular, until the French came. This curse was the result of a war, which is also why the only significant population on the island is the Kujo camp. Now, due to this war, no one actually owns the 2 islands, hence the name Kannazuka translating to something like Godless Hill. As for Yasuyori Island, starting with Nazuchi Beach, this island is even more war-torn than Kannazuka, and the entire island is engulfed by a thunderstorm because of this thing. Orobashi was a serpent god revered by the people of Watatsumi and coexisted with the shogunate for some time until he, for reasons to which I'll get later, laid claim to Yasuyori Island and was subsequently subjugated by splitting the island in 2. Now, after he was killed, Orobashi's resentful spirit, the Tatarigami, laid a curse upon the 2 islands, causing not only the lightning and thunder but also diseases and miasmas to decimate the population. Affected particularly badly was Hiri village. The economy relied entirely on selling crystal methamphetamine to the shogunate, which needed the substance to fuel the war efforts. Over time though, exports dried up, and due to either party's complete lack of empathy towards the village, it grew completely impoverished. But then, in a moment of elimination, the village chief, Washizu, had an idea. He seized the means of production and declared himself guardian of the village's shrine. Not before donating a sizable amount of the seized assets to a group of pirates. As expected, this did literally nothing to improve the village's situation, which could only rely on 2 pharmacists, Naoko and Yosamoto, to hopefully one day cure the ailments caused by the Tatarigami. While they were unable to, shocker, Naoko went insane and died in captivity, and Yosamoto, in imitating a common practice in socialist states, instead of actually creating a cure, made lavender melon sugar soup, which did, in fact, not help in the slightest. Washizu naturally found out and went insane himself, becoming schizophrenic to the point where he believed Orobashi was talking to him. To appease the imaginary voices, Washizu sacrificed every single thing he could lay his wrinkly old man eyes on, be that children, merchants trying to buy meth, or the few cats that hadn't been eaten by the desperate. So, yeah, the Tatarigami was pretty fucking bad, which also forced a stalemate between the shogunate and the remaining Watatsumi forces. But why did they even attack in the first place? The island was actually created by Orobashi to allow his subjects to return to the surface after eons of being locked away in forsaken depths outside of Teyvat. Naturally, this led to them developing a culture fundamentally different to the one prevalent on Narukami Island. These cultural differences also include reverence of Orobashi exclusively, so them not recognizing the Electro Archon couldn't have helped the friction between them and the shogunate. But to properly understand why Orobashi started a war he was seemingly always going to lose, and well, he did, we have to trace the Watatsumi people to their origins, found in Enkanomiya. Now, the most striking aspect of the sunken area are of course the ruins of a civilization so ancient its name has been completely lost. In fact, the civilization was the very first human civilization established in Teyvat shortly after the Primordial One claimed the continent for themselves. These ruins are of course also found in the chasm and Natlan, meaning it at one point spanned all across Teyvat. Anyways, onto the more pressing question, what the fuck are these ruins even doing down here? Well, prior to the Great War that had the Primordial One drop the Divine Nails, the land that would later come to be called Enkanomiya was still part of the Inazuma Peninsula, and as you might have guessed by now, sank into the ocean during the war, though what exactly caused that to happen isn't known. Now, the inhabitants naturally sank along with their land, and so they had to adapt to their new environment, in which lived beasts known as baptismal vishaps. These vishaps are direct descendants of the 7 sovereigns, and as such, they favored a hominid-based diet, much to the detriment of the people now living in the dark depths. For quite a long time, this predator-prey relationship continued, with the humans completely incapable of fighting back, which wasn't particularly helped by the fact that these depths were outside of the Primordial One's dominion, meaning they received no help from their former god. However, one of the Primordial One's shades, Istaroth, did aid them. She taught a scholar, Abrax, who later generations of Enkanomiyans would refer to as Aberaku, how to construct Helios, which would be passed down as the Dainichi Mikoshi. From there on out, the land would be called Byakuyakoku, translating to White Knight Realm. Through this artificial sun, the people were able to ward off the bishops who shunned the light. Relatable. No longer having to fear being consumed in the dark, they tried returning to the surface only to find the Primordial One had erected a barrier preventing them from leaving. Now, there's no in-game explanation as to why they did that, but I'd assume that the Primordial One wanted to prevent forbidden knowledge from entering Teyvat. As I again talked about in the Lore video, the Heavenly Principle sort of separated Teyvat from the rest of the planet and the universe, allowing them to rule with absolute authority without hindrance from any rules that might have applied to Teyvat otherwise. Now, considering the overwhelming presence of baptismal bishops in Enkanomiya, especially prior to the Dainichi Mikoshi, I'd assume this firmly places the area outside of Teyvat, as anything and everything to do with dragons was annihilated to the Heavenly Principle's best abilities after the New World was reigned in. So, as everything from outside of Teyvat would be deemed forbidden knowledge by the Primordial One, the entirety of Enkanomiya would be as well. Well, regardless. Now forced to remain in the depths for millennia, the people of Byakuyakoku started developing their own culture. They, for example, started revering Istarath due to her involvement with the Enkanomiyan salvation. At one point though, Ikebal seized power and mostly supplanted belief in Istarath by turning the Dainichi Mikoshi itself into a deity, only to proclaim a literal child as its representative, basically establishing a puppet king to rule through. Amiraku, who was at that point still alive, obviously protested but was promptly thrown into the gulags and died there. This dynasty would continue like that for some time and only fell due to a coincidence. While playing, a child descended into a cavern, eventually coming face to face with a gigantic serpent. Reacting in a very understandable and reasonable way, the child asked the serpent to become their people's new god, and inexplicably the serpent obliged. Surprise reveal, that serpent was, of course, Orobashi. Yeah. He ended the pretender's reign and initiated quite substantial cultural change. Istarath, if already mostly irrelevant during the time of Dainichi Mikoshi reverence, was forgotten entirely by the people. Also, and more importantly, Orobashi wasn't native to the depths of the underworld, instead having been a participant in the Archon Wars until he couldn't be bothered anymore and just left Teyvat. That meant that he was, in fact, familiar with the language spoken above ground, and so taught that tongue to his subjects. Now, at some point, Orobashi found a book. This book, before Sun and Moon, contained history on the beginning of the world, including the old world with the 7 sovereigns, along with the war instigated by the Primordial One's ascension. This led Orobashi to initiate experiments on bishops to find out more about the most ancient life forms of Teyvat. However, this knowledge had been banned by the Heavenly Principles after its victory, and as such, they found Orobashi and his subjects guilty of, I quote, 4 counts of the sin of profanity and a further 8 counts of the sin of deceiving living souls. Obviously, I have no fucking clue what that means, but as a result of the sentencing, Orobashi took all the blame and was sentenced to death. But because the Heavenly Principles are allegedly a huge fucking pussy, they didn't want to execute Orobashi themselves, and assumedly gave him a series of commands that would inevitably end in his demise. For one, they opened the seal and allowed the Byakuyakoku people to finally re-emerge, not as an act of kindness, but rather to prevent anyone else from acquiring extra forbidden knowledge like Orobashi had. Personally, I don't quite understand the motivation behind this, as the Primordial One has proven multiple times that it values life very little, so why it didn't just flop the shit out of Byakuyakoku is beyond me, but well, whatever. As alluded to in the Watatsumi section, Orobashi used the scales to form the island. Only what I didn't mention is that, when you think about it, an island made from nothing but scales is kind of fucking shit for, well, everything. So pretty much immediately upon arrival, a famine broke out owed to the fact that they couldn't grow any crops, and thus were deprived of their most essential of nutrients, Weetabix. Am I a Weetabixer or a Heatabixer? Well, honestly, I'd have to admit that I'm a— What the fuck are you talking about? Now, as you might imagine, a lack of food would be a fantastic reason to seek new territories, and indeed, the infertility of Watatsumi was a massive contributor to the aspirations pertaining to Yasuyori and Kannazuka. However, I'd wager if Orobashi hadn't been sentenced to death, he would have pursued a less radical approach. But that wasn't the case, and so he invaded Yasuyori Island and was subsequently obliterated by A, who, as was common with Archons back then, acted as the Heavenly Principle's vassal. That, though, wouldn't be the only time A subdued a god, only for the area in which they died to become uninhabitable. That's a very good transition, I'm proud of that one, and you better appreciate it, because it's not gonna get any better. When we arrive, the island is not entirely dissimilar to Yasuyori, shrouded in bale thunder, owed to a calamity that occurred sometime after the Archon Wars. That calamity refers to the Thunderbird, or Kannazuka, I have no fucking clue how to pronounce that, being slain on Seirai Island by A, as I hinted at. Now, Kannazuka is going to be more relevant when we talk about Tsurumi Island. For now, all that matters is that after she was slain, her remaining power was sealed away in Asase Shrine and would stay there for centuries. At one point though, a rebellion against the shogunate ensued on Seirai, leading to Asase Hibiki undoing the seal, which, while destroying the shogunate's fleet and being successful in that regard, also spawned the Bale Thunder. Also, the power coalesced to form the Thunder Manifestation. Fuck you personally, Asase Hibiki. Fuck you. Speaking of fuck you personally, see, I told you it's not gonna get better. This shit right here. Now, when looking at the ruins in the lowest topographical layers, you might find them familiar. They do in fact belong to the same ancient but not as ancient civilization found in Mondstadt, Araimi, etc. However, when looking at the surface, the architecture varies drastically, suggesting that the civilization found on the surface had very little connection to its forebears. That is, as I previously suggested in relation to the other ruins, due to a divine nail, the dropping of which was witnessed by Kannazuka, who reportedly found great joy in picking apart the deep-fried carcasses of the unfortunate cave dwellers. There were very few survivors, and thus was the architectural expertise of the previous civilization lost. The ones that settled on the surface though would, for the lack of any other deity, start revering Kannazuka, who in turn couldn't care less. Something I personally find very interesting about Tsurumi Island and its culture is that it isn't just different from the Narukami culture found on, well, Narukami Island for the most part, but that it is also based on a different group of people found in Japan. As while the Narukami culture is heavily based on the Yamato people, the ethnic majority of Japan, the Tsurumi Island culture is as apparent through several names based on the Ainu and indigenous people of mostly northern Japan and Siberia. While we added, the Enkanomiya culture differed vastly from the Narukami culture as well, and only somewhat assimilated, as I talked about earlier, because Orobashi introduced the Narukami language. Before that, names like Abrax and Helios leave very little option, but it seemed the Enkanomiya culture was initially based on the ancient Greeks, by proxy implying the entire civilization was. Interestingly enough, after the civilization was wiped off the face of the earth by the flood, the first civilization to re-emerge was Romeria, which is obviously inspired by the Romans, but I'll leave that for the 10 video, expect that in 2036. It's gonna be funny to see to what extent retention dropped after I started yapping. Whatever, I don't even care anymore. Regardless, the island is of course also shrouded in a thick fog, owed to the divine nail. Now, Kannazuka could have dispelled the fog, however she couldn't be asked, and so the people of the island coped, and started believing the fog had in fact been placed by their on-carrying goddess for their own safety, protecting them from whatever supposedly lurked off their shores. It was then that a young boy sang a song so enchanting Kannazuka descended from the clouds and befriended the boy. However, as she still didn't give a single shit about the tribe revering her, she eventually departed to another island as birds tend to do. The boy and his tribespeople, though, thinking they had in some way angered the Thunderbird, had an ingenious idea to remedy the perceived issue. So one day Kannazuka returned, hoping to hear the melody once again. Only she found the young boy dead, his blood filling a chalice, and the other tribespeople teabagging his pale body, performing a ritual with which they hoped to raise the Thunderbird's attention and appease her. One of those things they certainly did, as Kannazuka went on to slaughter every living soul on the island and requiem their asses, forcing them to relive the day of their annihilation over and over again. After that, she fucked off to Seirai Island, where she was subdued by A, as talked about earlier. So then there you have it, the entirety of Inazuma Lore, not a single aspect, not a single story left out, as I'm a very serious YouTuber with very serious intentions, and as such would not dare present incomplete or outright incorrect information. Thanks for watching, don't forget to like and subscribe, and remember, when you're down on your luck, your very own god could be waiting for you in your nearest borehole, canyon or chasm. Good luck!